Hey, I'm Jesse. Let's continue through Ezekiel. We're in chapter 29, and we looked at verses 1 through 16 yesterday. Today, we're going to look at verses 17 through 21 because God has more to say about Egypt. Now, some time has transpired between verses 1 through 16 and verses 17 through 21. And in this text, we get news that Ezekiel's silence, his muteness, has been broken by God. And there's something written about his oracles that we're reading right now that hits you and I square between the eyes right now as we read them. Okay, imagine reading a book that you thought was fiction, only to see it begin to describe the room you're sitting in and describe you reading that book as you read that book. Right? Spooky, right? If we grasp this, that's similar to the effect that this text has, only it's not an imaginary scenario. It's the Word of God alive. Look at this. In the 27th year, in the first month, on the first day of the month, the word of the Lord came to me. Okay, Ezekiel gives us some of these landmark times, and he even records how God tells him to record the time, and it helps us place his prophetic ministry along the timeline of events. Okay, by this time, Jerusalem has fallen. Okay, in verses 1 through 16, Jerusalem was about 7 months from falling. And now in verse 17, Jerusalem has long fallen. And what was prophesied, in chapter 24 and fulfilled in chapter 33 is that by this time, Ezekiel's tongue is loosed, and now he's able to speak as a priest again. We see in the text that he had a priestly ministry, but for a season here, God muted him unless he was prophesying, such that the only words that came out of Ezekiel's mouth were these words in this book. Okay, now that time has ended and Jerusalem has fallen. And it's probably about this time that Jeremiah, his contemporary, who was in Jerusalem for all of the horror show that went on during that final siege, is writing or has written the book of Lamentations. Go back and look at our series through Lamentations about the ruins. It's Jeremiah just looking out at the squalor that was once the city of God. And he doesn't say, "I told you so," but he does lament, hence the title, Lamentations. All right, so that's where we are in the historical timeline, given verse 17. Son of man, King Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon made his army labor strenuously against Tyre. Every head was made bald and every shoulder chafed, but he and his army received no compensation from Tyre for the labor he expended against it. Therefore, this is what the Lord God says: I'm going to give the land of Egypt to King Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon, and he will carry off its wealth, seizing its spoil and taking its plunder. This will be his army's compensation. All right. So we know that Nebuchadnezzar laid siege to Tyre for, I think, 13 years. And Tyre's superpower was its island fortress, about a half mile off the coast. So the mainland fortresses of Tyre were able to hold out for a long time. But he's ultimately left dissatisfied because the Tyrians, I think I'm using that right, I don't know, the people of Tyre were able to use that superpower and go off to their island fortress, and it's there they would remain safe until about 332 BC, when Alexander the Great would come and scrape the ruins of the mainland cities of Tyre into a causeway, a land bridge, to go out to that island and take it. So imagine Nebuchadnezzar's frustration when he, like everyone before him, had tried to take the city of Tyre, and he actually did manage to take the mainland fortresses, but there's still this last holdout. And it's like when you're hungry, all right, and you go to the restaurant and you order, and then you finish your meal too fast and you look at your empty plate and you're just not satisfied. Isn't that like the worst? Okay. I'm not afraid of a lot of things. I'm afraid of being eaten by a great white shark while I surf. I'm afraid of people hearing my preaching and then being shocked on Judgment Day in Matthew 7. But I also am afraid of ordering food at a restaurant and still being hungry. That's like the worst. All right, that's Nebuchadnezzar. After his 13-year siege of Tyre, he's not satisfied. Now, we've already seen in yesterday's devotion, God's going to bring Egypt down. He's going to cause them to be dispersed and in captivity and in desolation for 40 years before allowing them to return to their land. And in yesterday's devotion, and in devotion, was it 623, back in our series through Isaiah, we saw that God still has more to do with Egypt. In fact, he prophesies this triple alliance in the end, in the last days between Assyria and Egypt and Israel. And he refers to the Egyptians as his people. There's this revival coming for Egypt. But for now, they are still awaiting this captivity to come. And here's how God works it. Nebuchadnezzar was dissatisfied in his siege of Tyre. And so Nebuchadnezzar's compensation from God is going to be Egypt. Verse 20, I have given him the land of Egypt as the pay he labored for, since they worked for me. This is the declaration of the Lord God. In that day, I will cause a horn to sprout for the house of Israel, and I will enable you to speak out among them. Then they will know that I am the Lord. All right, so let's talk about verses 20 and 21 separately, because there's something profound here. Do you see what God just said in verse 20? He has given Nebuchadnezzar the land of Egypt as the pay he labored for, since they worked for me. So all this time, when the Babylonians were trying to take on Tyre, they were doing it on behalf of God. Now, they didn't know that. Okay? We'll talk more about this when we get to the book of Daniel. There's a chance you'll see Nebuchadnezzar in heaven. And in fact, Nebuchadnezzar contributed to the Bible. When we get to Daniel chapter 4, you're going to learn more about this fascinating guy, Nebuchadnezzar. He's easily viewed as the bad guy in this series through Ezekiel, but he's doing what he's doing under the sovereign hand of God. He may be doing it for his own reasons, and based on his interpretation, he might just look at the kingdom of Judah as this stubborn kingdom that's supposed to be under his kingdom. That's why he's referred to as a king of kings, not the capital K king of kings. That's Jesus. But he is in fact a king over kings. He is a king to whom other kings are subject. And Nebuchadnezzar's doing what he does. You'll learn more about him in the book of Daniel. And he's definitely viewed as the bad guy because the siege is brutal. But all the while, if you've been paying attention in our series through Lamentations, you've been paying attention in our series through Ezekiel, you know that God's the one who's at work through all of this to bring his wrath on his own people for their decades of idolatry and bloodshed, sacrificing their children, tolerating mass adultery, enabling pagan worship in the heart of God's temple, and corruption among all the elders who were worshiping the sun, for crying out loud. God has used Nebuchadnezzar and Babylon to pour out his discipline on his people. That's been Jeremiah's message. That's been Daniel's message. And now they're addressing the surrounding nations. And this is where their prophetic ministries coincide with those of Amos and Obadiah, particularly as they speak to Edom, as we've already seen in some of our devotions. So God was using Nebuchadnezzar. God caused Nebuchadnezzar's Babylon, according to the text, to work for him. To work for him. Okay? This is kind of crazy. I've seen God do this. I once worked with someone who kind of went on a rampage, and trying to just take everybody down. And what's funny is, like, this guy had a rap sheet of his own, and in that regard, he's kind of like Babylon. Yeah, he's kind of like Moab. He's kind of like these other pagan nations. Like, he's got his own stuff. But what's crazy is that in his rampage, he also kind of did some good. It's like he was doing it for his own reasons, for his own self-aggrandizement. But God's hand was at work. All right, God used Moab to discipline Israel. God can use Nebuchadnezzar to discipline Israel. God can use anyone, even those who don't profess belief in him, even those who bow down to false idols. Even the people who were carrying out the crucifixion of Jesus were used to prophesy. Even Balaam, the prophet for hire, was used by God to speak blessings over Israel. No one's off limits. Okay, regardless of what jersey you're wearing, ultimately God can use anyone on his team. And so verse 20 is worth a look, all right? Because, I mean, presidents of nations, COOs of companies, neighborhood gossips, like they may do what they do for their own reasons, but God is sovereign and the architect behind history, and the whole building culminates in the glory of God in the end. So these three words just really stick with me. He gave Egypt to Nebuchadnezzar because Nebuchadnezzar worked for God. Okay, now stay tuned. Like I said, there's more to come on Nebuchadnezzar. He goes literally crazy for a few years and even contributes to the Bible in Daniel chapter 4. All right, now verse 21. This horn that would sprout for the house of Israel, this is a symbol of authority. Okay, in our year of prophecy, get used to seeing this, because horns are symbols of authority. And so he's gonna cause authority to return for Israel, and he's gonna allow Ezekiel to speak out among them, and then they will know that I am the Lord. So imagine now, as we're past the halfway point in the book of Ezekiel, the book of Ezekiel is it just chronicles his oracles given to him by God. It doesn't include a great deal of biographic information. We know that he was the son of a priest, that he had priestly duties, that he had come of age to serve as a priest about the time that he was in captivity in Babylon. And we know where he was when he saw this vision of God. Ezekiel chapter 1, like we said, is one of the most spectacular chapters in the Bible. And then aside from that, there's not much biographic information about Ezekiel. In chapter 24, we know he spoke what God told him to say in the morning, and then his wife died in the evening. But now, after giving these oracles about Egypt and how Egypt's going to fall and be in captivity for 40 years, and then years go by and we get verses 17 through 21, we see how God's going to do it and why God's going to do it, because Babylon couldn't take Tyre completely. Okay, Alexander the Great would do that in 332 BC. God's going to give Egypt to Babylon as compensation for the 13 years they spent laying siege to Tyre. And at the very end, you see this word about Ezekiel's words, that Ezekiel would speak out among them. And then they'll know that he's the Lord. Okay, here's where, to me, this text leaps off the page and just hits me right between the eyes. At this point, Ezekiel's called every shot and been exactly right. And by this time, years have gone by, and Ezekiel's ministry may not have been popular. We know that Jeremiah's ministry certainly wasn't popular. Jeremiah would tell everybody, he'd be like the only prophet in the room saying, no, we're going down. No, Jerusalem's going to be burned. Jerusalem's going to be captured. This is the discipline of God. You guys are opposed to Nebuchadnezzar, but Nebuchadnezzar is actually a tool in the hand of God being used to bring discipline on us for our rampant idolatry and adultery and child sacrifice and murder. Like God's doing this to us. And then the leadership of Israel is like, we don't really like this Jeremiah guy. We prefer instead these guys who are telling us that this siege business is only going to last 2 years, and then God's going to break the back of Babylon. Put Jeremiah in the dungeon. Okay, years have gone by, and at this point in Ezekiel's chronicled oracles, the original recipients had to have picked up on the fact that Ezekiel's been right the entire time. And what God has told Ezekiel is they're going to start listening to you. Okay, they're going to start listening to you. Now, it's not a coincidence then. God has told Jerusalem over and over again, your doom is coming. And now at this point in the chronology of Ezekiel, that doom has come. Okay, for 70 years, they're going to be in captivity in Babylon, and then they're going to get to come home. Okay, but now it's captivity time. And at this point, they finally have to realize, like, we've been listening to guys like Hananiah. Hananiah said that the siege would last 2 years and they'd be gone. And that was like, at this point, what, 7 years ago? I don't even know. And like, so obviously the guys who were telling us, that the housing market's not going to collapse in 2007 are not trustworthy financial advisors or forecasters. Okay. Like, clearly we got to listen to the actual prophets. Somebody go get Jeremiah out of the dungeon, because it turns out he was right and we owe him an apology. All right, somebody actually, like, maybe there's more to Daniel's dreams and prophecies than we first thought. Maybe there's more to Daniel than just his capacity to govern. Like, maybe this Ezekiel guy's actually right. Okay, now here's the thing: you and I now bear an even bigger weight than the original recipients of Ezekiel, because we have all 48 chapters of Ezekiel, and the only prophecies unfulfilled are those that would be fulfilled at the end of days anyway. Okay, so you know that the book of Ezekiel is reliable because everything that it had to say in the immediacy of the Babylonian captivity and even to the nations surrounding Israel has all come true. And the only prophecies in Ezekiel that haven't come true describe the end of the world. And the world is currently still spinning. Therefore, it's not time for them yet, obviously. Or, hey, do you follow my math here? You and I look at the historical record, the archaeological record. We look at even the current state of things. Like we mentioned yesterday, Egypt's GDP. It's perfectly on track with everything that Ezekiel said would happen. Israel's GDP, the fact that Israel exists right now, just wait until we get further into Ezekiel. It's at this point that Ezekiel's prophetic ministry to Israel becomes positive. And we're going to start seeing hope at last in Ezekiel's prophecies. So I'm proud of you, okay, if you've stuck with us this far into the book of Ezekiel, where it's all just been like doom and gloom and then more gloom and then more doom. All right, because now the people finally start listening. After the siege of Jerusalem, that's what it takes for them to finally listen. Now this horn, this symbol of authority, is caused to sprout for the house of Israel, and Ezekiel's enabled to speak out among them, and they're going to know that he's the Lord. So watch for the turning point that takes place around this portion of Ezekiel, especially when we get into like chapter 32 and beyond, chapter 34, chapter 37, probably the most famous chapter in Ezekiel aside from chapter 1. Finally, at long last, we're going to be able to see the positivity come out of Ezekiel's prophetic ministry. And it's a beautiful thing to behold. It's a riveting thing to see. And these prophecies pertain to you and me. This prophet with a perfect prophecy fulfillment rate, okay, or perfect pattern of prophecy, depending on how you choose to interpret it, he's got more to say for you and me. We have more proof of the legitimacy of Ezekiel's prophetic ministry, more proof that the Lord is God. We know that the Lord is God because we see Ezekiel call God's shots, okay, as God tells him to, and then we read the account of the prophecy, we behold the account of its fulfillment. We read the account of the prophecy, we behold the account of its fulfillment over and over again, and the intention, the purpose, over 50 times in this book is so that you would know that he's the Lord. The original recipient still had years left of Ezekiel's ministry. We have all 48 chapters. We're working our way through them now. And guess what? Ezekiel, the prophet with the perfect fulfillment rate, has more to say about us today as we approach the end times. It's incredible. It's incredible. Right? Indeed, this horn of authority has sprouted from Israel. He is speaking out to you and me right now. Know that the Lord is God.